I'd like to talk a moment about undue burden in the context of implementing reasonable accommodations. So you've worked with the student, you've determined these accommodations would be of benefit to the student, and you're looking at implementation. There are times when the resources, the cost, the energy and effort in implementing an accommodation create a burden in one form or another. One type of burden is financial burden. And while the law recognizes that, it's a really high standard of comparing the cost of implementing the accommodation to the overall budget of the institution. So that's a high standard and is almost never used, and certainly rarely has never been used in a court case or a complaint defense because it is such a high standard. Administrative burden, the pragmatics of implementing an accommodation, is more often the case. Sometimes it's a context where it's just not possible, and sometimes it's a context of the energy, effort, and resources involved. So for one, if a student requested and could use unlimited time on testing, I had a student once who could reasonably demonstrate that both a wide range of time of when to start the test and then unlimited time in taking the test would certainly have been of benefit to her based on the impact of her condition. From that perspective, it was reasonable, but as an office, I can't schedule a room for when the student is ready to take the test and for an unlimited period of time to have a proctor available and space available and managed and supervised. So it just becomes not possible, and at that point have to look at what are the boundaries of feasible and possible in terms of testing accommodations, space, proctoring, etc. Similar to that, or in the same vein of testing accommodations, there are students for whom their condition, the type of processing or learning disability that they have, make a particular test format more beneficial or easier for them to contend with. It is a matter of their condition, not a matter of preference and learning, but the professor tests, say, in multiple choice formats, and the student would prefer essays. Converting a multiple choice test to an essay test and saying the forms are equivalent, they measure the same thing, is an incredibly difficult task to do well. It requires the kind of resources places like ETS and the National Board of Medical Examiners use to create alternate versions of a test with equivalent formats. And so that's difficult to do to the point of impractical and impossible because the skill and expertise isn't there, as well as the time and the resource in terms of time as a principal resource and skill. So those are undue administrative burdens. In a different sort of way, I once worked in a rural location where you get a last-minute accommodation request, or one that's last-minute in the context of the pool of interpreters available to you, and you start making phone calls to schedule an interpreter for, say, an event. And as you move out and away from your location and exhaust the pool of interpreters, you may reach the point where there simply isn't one available for that moment in time. And then you would need to ask what alternatives the student might use. You might look at remote interpreting as an alternative, depending on the nature of the event. That may be reasonable. You might look at captioning as an alternative, but their first request that I gave deference to, a live interpreter for the event, was just not administratively feasible because there was no one available on that notice for that location.